Is already being recorded.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess we'll start. Hi everyone, our speaker today is Prashant Khande. He works at Qualcomm Flarion Technologies and he's also a PhD student at Princeton University. Today he's going to be talking to us about some work he's been doing recently and a paper that he's going to be presenting in Infocom. This has to do with what happens when a service provider has the possibility of paying for your broadband connection and the implications that arise from that.
Thanks, Raj. The title is Network Rate Allocation through Two-Sided Pricing. So two sides being the two sides involved in the data exchange over the internet. I'm relatively new to this area aspect, so I don't intend this to be a talk as and turn out to be more of a discussion, and I welcome that. So here's a brief overview of what we're going to discuss today. So I'll quickly give a brief introduction to the network economic interaction over the internet, and then we'll introduce two-sided pricing and our modeling effort on two-sided pricing. We'll discuss implications that it has on this much debated topic of network neutrality before concluding. Okay, so the internet is a complicated set of interactions between multiple entities, which ultimately defines the data rate flows and the capacity occupancy of the various things. It's complicated both from an economics point of view as well as from a technological point of view. We can try to simplify the picture a little bit. There's data that flows between end users and what I call as content providers, but it could very well be an application provider as well. I'll use the term content provider going forward, but it could very well stand for an application provider of the internet. So data flows between end users and content providers for a network provisioned by one or more ISPs. That's a simplified picture. On top of it, you can put the complexities of content distribution network overlays and P2P overlays that might very well affect the data flows. On the economics front, there is the transit and peering relationship between ISPs, between ISPs and content distribution networks, and actually these days between ISPs and content providers as affecting the data flow.
So just can you give us an example of a content distribution network, and so how is it really different from the ISP? What do you mean by content distribution network?
So there are these content distribution networks operated by entities like Akamai, Limelight.
Okay, like that.
Right. So content distribution network is where they host content on behalf of content providers, and they host content at various various servers of theirs that are located in a geographically distributed manner. So the idea here is that from an end user's point of view, content need not be accessed by the server hosted by the provider. It's geographically distributed and it's much easier to fetch content. So they provide this as a service. Okay, so here's a diagram that depicts the pricing relationships between various entities on the internet. It's somewhat simplified by the removal of the content distribution network and the P2P part. Okay, so there's the transit pricing. There's the transit cost charged by transit ISPs to local ISPs typically, and even large content providers for access to the rest of the internet. Okay, that's the transit pricing part. Then there is the peering price. Okay, the peering relationship is typically between two ISPs of roughly the same size, and the marginal cost of peering relationship is typically set to zero. They agree to exchange data mutually at essentially zero marginal cost. Then there is the access price paid for by both the end users as well as smaller content providers and application providers to the local ISPs for access to the rest of the internet. The end users usually pay what's called as a retail access price, which tends to be priced in terms of megabytes of volume. That's the price that you and me pay. On the content side, the content providers typically pay what's called a wholesale access price, which tends to have the same form as the transit the transit price. That tends to be of the order of $10 to $100 per megabits per second of data. Okay, it's counted in terms of megabits per second per month. Yeah.
So this picture, is it supposed to reflect the state of affairs today, or is it part of your model you're planning?
No, this is reflecting the state of the affairs today.
Okay.
Yeah. So we haven't gotten into our modeling effort yet. So this is what is the current status.
So then, why is it that you think the user pays per megabyte? Is that really true?
Yeah. So there's two kinds of access price typically. There's the flat rate model where you don't pay on a usage basis, but there's also the usage based model. Many ISPs, if you notice, actually have started introducing a usage based model. Even with the flat rate model, there is an understanding that there is a certain cap beyond which ISPs are not quite ready to give you the data for free. So, yeah, but you're right. I mean, there is a flat rate model too. But
so, Prashant, I want to go back and ask the question I asked. I was trying to understand exactly this picture, right? So, if you have the content distribution network here, where do they fit in this sort of this flow diagram you have, how the dollars flow?
yeah, so I haven't looked at that extensively.
I mean, is my question clear?
Yeah, my understanding is that what a content distribution network does in this case is host content closer to the local ISPs. So as a result, the local ISP's cost of getting content from transit ISPs goes down, and the cost for the content providers that they have to pay to the transit ISP also goes down. But instead, of course, they need to pay the content distribution networks.
So they get money from the local ISP and from some content provider.
Yeah, so typically content distribution networks have followed the model where they get where they get the payment from the content providers. But there have been models where there have been business cases where they're extracted a price from the local ISPs as well. Okay, so why two-sided pricing? I mean, as we discussed just now, the predominant price per bit of data that flows between end users and content provider is the price paid for by the end user. Okay, so there might be a case for the content providers chipping in more of that price. Content providers have actually been looking at ways to improve connectivity to end users. Content distribution networks, in fact, emerged partly because of that need. On the technology side, they actually reduced the perceived delay in the traffic from content provider to the end user. On the economic side, as I just mentioned, they reduced the transit price, both for the content provider as well as the local ISP that's serving the end user. So there's an overall improvement in end users' connectivity as a result of this. There are other ways in which content providers have tried to improve users' connectivity. We're just talking about the Google Wi-Fi network. That was an attempt essentially by a content provider or an application provider to reach the end users, to provide better connectivity to the end users. So the question that we can ask here is can content providers actually subsidize end users' broadband access as yet another way to improve users' connectivity? So in the meanwhile, ISPs have actually been looking at ways to generate additional revenue to fund their network expansion. Okay, and from the regulator's point of view, they are looking at ways to stimulate internet use and improve broadband penetration. And two-sided pricing might provide them with a tool to do that. The content provider payment can generate funds required for expansion of internet into, let's say, rural areas, and which regulators are very much interested in. But of course, they need to keep in mind whether this will actually adversely affect the content providers, in particular, actually the competitiveness of the content market. So there are definitely a ton of issues that are of interest to everyone in this market. Okay, so two-sided pricing is not actually uncommon. It's pretty common practice, especially in the wireless world. I mean, in the wireless world, many of the wireless ISPs are known to control and price the applications that use the data pipes. For example, the NTT Docomo iMode model is a model where the application providers are actually charged a percentage of the revenue, presumably for the billing services, but they are essentially charged a percentage of the revenue to reach the end users. The Amazon Kindle is another example, which is Kindle is an e-reader device which has wireless connectivity, and the end user does not pay for that wireless connectivity directly. So Amazon pays for that thing, that wireless connectivity. So in the wireline world, though, two-sided pricing has been less common, although many ISPs have actually voiced their intention, and that has triggered debates on network neutrality. We'll talk about that shortly. So overall, it does look like two-sided pricing is a new opportunity for ISPs, content providers, and end users. But there are a lot of questions that are unanswered here, and it's waiting for more advances, both on the technology front as well as on the economics front. On the technology front, I guess we need new and more transparent and scalable mechanisms to price internet connection and deliver internet connectivity services than what exists today. And these mechanisms will have to derive from modeling the economics of it. Okay, so if you have like robust economic models that show the resulting trade-offs, then you can design these mechanisms to approach the desirable equilibrium in the economics modeling that you have. So ours is an effort on the economic side, actually, in modeling the trade-offs involved in this kind of a interaction. Okay, so a quick scan through the literature that has talked about some of these aspects. So Kelly in 1997 actually proposed price-based rate allocation in a situation that involved users and the network. In his case, it was the network, but essentially it's the ISP provided network. So that did not include the content provider, and our work actually extends that work by introducing the content provider into the picture, the other side into the picture. So Tirole and a bunch of other economists have actually provided a very broad framework for what's known as two-sided markets. We'll talk about two-sided markets a little more, but the two-sided markets have provided a framework based on which many analysis of the network neutrality debate has taken place. In particular, Walren analyzes a model where the user click rate is modeled as a function of the ISP and content provider investment, and they find regimes where two-sided pricing is acceptable. And Economides has a model where the ISP is considered as a monopoly or a duopoly, and then they assume specific linear externality inducing utilities to model the network neutrality effect, and they find no acceptable regimes where two-sided pricing is acceptable. There have been other work as well. So Mackie, Mason, and Varian as well as Kessilis have analyzed usage-based pricing and flat rate pricing, which we talked about a little before. But they don't consider two-sided pricing directly. Hermalin has looked at network neutrality from a product differentiation point of view, not quite from a two-sided pricing point of view.
So are all these two-sided markets the same? Like you described a variety of them, and it seems like, to me, they all seem different.
So
I mean, somehow, for instance, Kindle, right? So for instance, I'm familiar with how that works. So how is that two-sided?
okay, so yeah, so
Yes.
I mean, Kindle is. So if you look at the connectivity part of Kindle, right, the connectivity price is paid entirely by Amazon, as far as the ISP is concerned.
Right, so they rent service from T-Mobile or Sprint or somebody, right?
That's right. They rent it from Sprint and they pay for the connectivity. So here's a model where the traditional thinking about connectivity is that the end user pays for connectivity. But the Kindle brings a picture where it's the other side who's paying for the connectivity completely. So two-sided pricing is just the possibility of pricing not just one side but both the sides. If the pricing eventually turns out to have a structure where the entire price comes from the other side, then that's something that you can derive from that model. But from that aspect, this is a two-sided market.
And it's two-sided because there's a single entity that is paying two different people. It's because Amazon pays the access provider something for carrying the bits to the user, and they pay the content provider, the person who provided the book, for the.
No. So okay, yeah, that's not the way I was looking at it. So I was looking at the ISP as the supplier of connectivity service, and I focused on the connectivity market.
All right.
So typically, the ISP gets a payment only from one side, which is the end user. I'm considering the possibility of the end user as well as the application provider both paying for that connectivity.
Okay.
And in the Amazon case, it turns out that the relationship is such that there's only payment from one side.
Well, but in any economic state, right? The user
Exactly.
is paying Amazon to
That's right.
pay them. So.
That's right.
Okay.
So yeah, so actually, I'll talk a little bit more about two-sided markets shortly after I introduce this model, and then I guess it becomes a little more clear.
Prashant, just to clarify, in your two-user pricing, sorry, what do you call it?
Two-sided pricing, yeah.
Model, are two different entities paying the same person?
Yeah, so there is one connectivity service provider, which is
Okay.
the ISP,
Okay,
and the two sides
are
are
the
paying.
user and the service and the data provider.
That's right. So any data exchange is between two entities.
Okay.
Right.
So this Kindle model, strictly speaking, doesn't really fit that definition, then, right?
Implicitly, it does because they.
Because the user's
Amazon
not
built-
paying Sprint.
No, but the Amazon built that into the pricing structure of the books you got.
Okay.
Yeah, so we can. So I'll go a little bit more about
Yeah, it
the
is
modeling
implicit.
assumptions that we make,
It is implicit.
and we'll actually discuss why the Kindle model might not fit this particular model that we have, and we might need like more work to incorporate the Kindle model. So we developed a framework based on a few assumptions, and one of the key assumptions is that there is a single representative ISP operating all the links between the end user and the content provider.
So maybe just right for they're gonna have the Kindle app on the iPhone.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
coming up, so maybe that's two-sided.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I guess in the case of the Kindle app, the data is still paid for by the end user so far.
You don't think Amazon pays a fee to someone to somehow be able to have a Kindle app on an iPhone?
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. In fact, I think there is a company called MBlogs that has recently introduced content provider paid for applications. So the user need not activate a data plan, but the data plan comes bundled with some content. So there are those possibilities that are being considered. Okay, so going back to the assumptions that we make here, we assume a single representative ISP operating all the links between the end user and the content provider. As we discussed before, the end user payment is the predominant part of the price per bit that's paid. The price per bit of data that flows between the end user and the content provider. And typically the end user access network is the bottleneck network, and the ISP that is the bottleneck ISP will be the one which has the pricing power. So we can view the access ISP, the end user access ISP, as the representative ISP. Content distribution networks in fact bring content closer to the local ISPs, further justifying why we can view why we can think of a single representative ISP model. In any case, I think we can always view this as ISPs acting in unison when it comes to pricing the content provider on one side and the end user on the other side. and then splitting the revenue amongst themselves based on the pairing and transit relationships that they had amongst themselves. Okay, a second assumption that we make is on the economics of it. It's typically hard to separate out the user's valuation of content and connectivity. Okay, so that ties together the content and connectivity economics and makes it harder to analyze that market. But if you notice, I should rather say like maybe a lot of content these days on the internet is available for free. Okay, and that enables us to decouple the content economics from connectivity economics and allows us to focus on the price paid by the end user as totally meant on the connectivity part. So that's an assumption that we make. We also notice that the content providers typically demonstrate what's called as a long tail distribution, where there are a large number of content providers, each catering to a small segment of user population. So that enables us to model the content provider as a price taker. The price taker is someone who accepts the market price and does not anticipate the effect of their own demand on the market prices. So, yeah, one last assumption that we make is on the capacity provisioning. We assume that capacity can be provisioned infinitely, and then there's a constant cost of provisioning capacity. But the model can be extended easily to the case where there's fixed capacity or, for that matter, convex capacity costs.
So why is the content provider the price taker and not the end user?
The end user is definitely a price taker.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, content providers need not be price taker. I mean, thinking of a content provider like Google, which has much larger market power, then they need not be a price taker. I mean. So I use the term price taker from an economics point of view. Price taker is someone who just accepts market price and does not anticipate the changes in the market demand because of the market price based on their demand. And monopolies are typically not price takers. A monopoly has complete control on the prices. So we'll go into some of those things shortly. Okay, so a little more on this two-sided connectivity market. So ISP. So a two-sided market is one where there's a platform which provides the setup over which two sides interact with each other, and then there is a pricing aspect of like how do you charge the two sides. Okay, so ISP here is the platform over which two sides, end user and content provider, interact with each other. Let's say the ISP charges a price of P to the end user and a price of Q to the content provider. Then the market is called two-sided if the price structure, that's the precise split of the price between P and Q, is what determines the market volume, the amount of interaction, rather than the price level, the sum of the prices P and Q, determining the market volume. Okay, so that's when it's called a two-sided market. There are other examples of two-sided market that economists have analyzed. There are the auction sides, and credit card market is another two-sided market. Advertising market is in fact a big two-sided market. So a key insight into two-sided market is that you need to price, the platform needs to price each side based on the utility induced to the other side. So that needs to be taken into account. In fact, that's what gives the price structure some meaning, okay, in the case of two-sided markets. So our model will essentially look into the possibility of pricing the content provider, possibly for the utility induced by end users to the content provider side, in terms of, let's say, generating advertising revenue to the content provider side. Okay, so here's the.
So in your model, whatever you call as the platform is the one that sets these prices.
Okay, so we consider various conditions on the platform market. So the platform here is ISP, and ISP could be in a monopoly market where they have complete price control, or it could be in a competitive market where there's no price control. Those are the two possibilities that we consider. It could be somewhere in between too. So this is the setup. So there's a single representative ISP, and there's the end user and the content provider on either side, and data F of ij is the data flow between end user I and content provider j. And associated with this flow is a data rate xf. Okay, xf is the data rate in this case. So the end user has a utility u of xf and content provider has a utility v of xf. The content provider utility could be viewed as the, let's say, the advertising revenue that's generated based on the data rate xf. There's the price per unit data rate charged by the ISP to the end user, given by P, and Q is the price per unit data rate charged by the ISP to the content provider. So U of I is the set of all flows associated with end user I, and C of J is the set of flows associated with content provider J.
Does the utility of the content provider have to be something coming from an external source like advertising or coming from the user itself?
Okay, so that's what I talked about a little while ago when I spoke about separating content and connectivity economics. So I'm assuming, so the simplest way to look at this picture is to assume that the content provider's revenue comes from an alternate source. Like for example, when the content is given away for free and you generate revenue through advertising sources. It's also possible to think of a case where the revenue comes from explicit charging of users for content. But in that case, we need to look at the user utility as the utility associated with the connectivity aspect of it and not the content aspect of it. So that becomes a little tricky because from a user's point of view, there is no clear-cut separation about content and connectivity. I mean, when you're downloading a book from Amazon, you're not thinking about whether you're paying for the book or whether you're paying for just the downloading aspect of it. So the second scenario that I'm talking about needs I would say a little more unrealistic assumptions or probably further extension of this model to incorporate such things. But yeah, the main situation that I'm considering is the case where the revenue comes from an alternate source. Okay, so there's the end user.
So therefore, in your model right now, can you go back one slide? So therefore, you're assuming that the U of XF and the V of XF, they're sort of essentially now independent.
That's right.
That's what you're sort of assuming.
That's right. Yeah.
They're not independent, they depend on XF.
Yeah, but besides that, I mean, he's saying he's not looking at any other
Connection.
correlation which may actually be there.
That's right. Okay, so both the end user as well as the content provider is a price taker in the based on the assumptions that we have made. The end user demand function can easily be generated by a simple maximization problem, maximization of the net utility, which is the utility minus the cost. So resulting in a end user demand function y of p, and the content provider does the same thing, maximizes the net utility and results in a content provider demand function z of q. So y of p is a function that represents the end user demand and is dependent upon the end user price p, and z of q depends upon the content provider price q. Okay, so first we consider a competitive platform, okay, competitive ISP market. So in this case, the ISP is also a price taker, just like the content provider and the end user. So ISP does not set the market price. The market price is actually set by the market, the invisible hand in the market. Okay, so we assume a single link just for simplicity. Otherwise, we can look at a network of links and look at flows occupying this set of links on fixed routes. Anyway. And mu is the cost of provisioning capacity on that link. Again, I mean, it can be extended easily to the case where the capacity cost is fixed. The capacity itself is fixed. Okay, so ISP being a price taker maximizes the net profit, which is the revenue minus the cost, subject to the constraint of the capacity that the data flows don't exceed the capacity limit. The variables that are under the ISP control is just the data rate and the capacity that the ISP can provision, not the prices themselves.
So in what sense do the end user and do the content provider have alternatives to the ISP to use? The ISP
So there are multiple ISPs essentially in a competitive ISP market. If not for this, they can go into some other ISP. So if this ISP ends up charging a price that's more than the market price, So this is this is just a classical
So,
a competitive
you
market analysis.
abstracted the existence of the other ISPs to, there's
That's
some market price for the
I've picked a
two-sided
representative.
connectivity.
That's right. I've picked one ISP out of several competitive ISPs.
But typically, right, like the sort of the thing that goes on with access, right, is that the ISPs aren't all the same, right? One will be a better ISP for a particular end user or a particular content provider. And,
In terms of, let's say, maybe
covering
covering.
wireless access.
So I think, but his model is sort of broadly, when he says there's something called an ISP, I think he calls it as, go back and show you a picture of the representative ISP, right? I thought he had one ISP for the end user, one on the other side for the content, and some backbone stuff in the middle, and he calls the whole thing with some.
But the idea that, there's a market price for that connection to the end user, it seems like, there might be in one locale, one local ISP was kind of, who has a monopoly, who could do monopolistic pricing.
Yeah, so I agree. I mean, if you're pointing out that it's unrealistic to assume a completely competitive ISP market, I think that's definitely the case. I mean, if at all, I guess the ISP market is more on the monopoly side. So what I do in this work is analyze it from two different points of view. What happens if it is actually a truly competitive market, and what happens if it's a truly monopoly ISP? So I'll get into the monopoly part.
So we're going to start with there is a competitive market and there's a market price for that.
And there's a market price, exactly. Yeah, that's the assumption. So, I mean, in a competitive market, you essentially have two or sometimes, let's say in this case, three entities, all of them taking a market-given price and generating their demand. Okay, it's really a game between two or three entities, and the equilibrium, the Nash equilibrium that comes out of this game is where the competitive market equilibrium exists. And it's a well-known fact that competitive market equilibrium maximizes the overall net surplus of the entities involved. Okay, so we look into that equilibrium, the equilibrium that results from this three-way interaction in this case, as opposed to the two-way interaction without content provider pricing. So without content provider pricing, the equilibrium price for the end user, in fact, turns out to be simply the cost of provisioning capacity. And with content provider pricing, the equilibrium prices are such that the sum of the end user price and the content provider price is equal to the cost of capacity. It's a fairly simple result actually. And the price is actually split in such a way so as to equate the two demand, the end user demand and the content provider demand. And we can show that this structure in fact maximizes the system surplus or the total surplus, which is simply the surplus is nothing but the net economic benefits to each side. That was the objective function in the maximization problem for each of the three entities. So it's simply the sum of the net utilities. Actually, net utilities for content provider and end user, and the net profit for the ISP. So the sum of these three is the total surplus, and we can show that this particular competitive market equilibrium maximizes that surplus. But that again, it's a classical result in the competitive market world, but we have shown that in this particular setting where there's two-sided pricing.
So it's the ISP that has essentially no role.
In a competitive market, the ISP makes zero profit. It can price it.
Yeah, it's a
That's-
commodity.
Exactly. Okay, now we look at an exact opposite situation where the ISP has complete market control. Okay, the ISP is a monopoly and they can actually set the prices. So the ISP maximization problem is a little different here. The ISP is maximizing the net profit, which is again the revenue minus the cost. The constraint remains the same. Data rates cannot exceed the capacity, but the optimization variables change a little bit. The ISP can control what the market prices are in this case. Okay. So the prices are in addition to the data rate and the capacity, the prices are also under the ISP control. So it's monopoly markets are typically analyzed in terms of what's called as elasticities of demand. Elasticity of demand is simply the negative of the ratio of the rate of change of demand to the average demand. So the elasticity of demand is actually a positive quantity because the rate of change of demand is actually negative. Higher the price, lower the demand. Okay, and a low elasticity of demand indicates that that particular economic agent has a high propensity to accept a high price because if the prices go up, they're not going to like drop the demand significantly now. That's the intuitive understanding of elasticity of demand. Okay, so without content per order pricing, the equilibrium structure is such that the end user price depends upon the cost of capacity nu, as well as the end user price elasticity. Okay, and higher the price elasticity, closer the cost, closer the price of end user is to the cost of capacity. And as if the elasticity of demand goes down, lower the elasticity of demand, the price is actually a markup over the cost of capacity. Okay, that's the way the price is split without content per order pricing.
Somehow, do you set a price for each user, or do you have to announce a price that, you know, in terms of ISPs and access, the models tend to be, the ISP announces the price for it, and
Yeah.
some users derive the higher utility based on that, and others get lower utility because the users are different.
Yeah, that's a good point. So in this case, I assumed that the prices are actually flow specific. I mean, if you think about it, actually, the user specific pricing is actually is something that a monopoly would always want to do, but is kind of restricted from doing it in most markets because the users can actually trade among themselves and pull down the price to be one uniform price. Whereas with broadband connection, there is no such thing that's possible. So there's a better case here for a monopoly to charge on a per flow basis or a per user basis. And the pricing model that I assume here is a per flow based pricing model. So we're working on extending this into cases where the pricing has to be uniform across all the flows. And that's the typical, that's a more realistic assumption that ISPs can actually make.
I think it's, you know, maybe it's different if it's wired versus wireless. You know, like in the wireless scenario, it's sort of the physical notion of you have to announce a price out into the radio space. It's somehow more consistent, whereas on wired connection, there's nothing that stops Verizon from sending me an announcement in the mail that says, you know, for you, we'll give you a special price, and the neighbor who has the same kind of a wire gets a different price.
Yeah, so
let's, maybe I'm getting you off track. So.
yeah, I guess price discrimination is something that ISPs will definitely resort to if they can, but I guess some of the network neutrality issues actually is concerned about this possible price discrimination and how to prevent such pricing. So we'll actually talk about some of those things shortly. So with content per order pricing, the equilibrium structure actually turns out to have has some similarity to the case without content per order pricing. The prices actually split up the cost of capacity as well as the resulting markup, and the share of each entity depends upon their elasticity of demand. Okay, so higher the elasticity of demand of a given site, lower the price share is. Further, the price is actually split in such a way so as to equate the demand on the two sides. Okay, that's the equilibrium structure. In fact, you can show that if any one entity has a high, if the elasticity of demand of any one entity increases, the prices for both of them, both the sides actually go down. Okay. So I mean, it's apparent from that for the end user, the ability to the equilibrium structure with content per order pricing has resulted in a net benefit, provided that the content per order elasticity of demand is actually greater than 1, which is typically the case. The end user actually has gained from content provider participation. But it is unclear whether the content provider has gained from this, or for that matter, whether the ISP has gained from this. Also unclear is whether what has happened to the total surplus in this market. Okay, so those are some of the things that we'll investigate shortly. One quick thing about one quick point about the equilibrium monopoly price. The equilibrium monopoly price actually could go down if the content provider elasticity of demand is in fact lower than that of the end user elasticity of demand. So the ISP will actually have to charge a price that's less than what they are charging without the content provider participation, just to keep the content provider on board in this case. Okay, so before we go into the surplus analysis, what happens to content provider surplus, what happens to ISP surplus, we'll briefly discuss this topic of network neutrality. Network neutrality is a term that means different things to different set of people, but we will focus on the pricing aspect of it and the price-based discrimination of or differentiation of content by ISPs. So many network neutrality proponents have actually opposed such differentiation. So the ISP's intention to differentiate between traffic based on the prices is typically attributed to ISP's own interest in competing content that they can provide. So the other thing that neutrality proponents have talked about is the loss of competition in the content world. Larger content providers like Google and Yahoo can actually pay their way into better user experience and reduce competition. That's a problem. And neutrality proponents have suggested that capacity expansion and not content provider pricing is what ISP should be focused on. So ISPs, on the other hand, argue that to generate funds for the capacity expansion, they need to resort to content provider pricing. Okay. And one of their arguments is that as long as they can price content according to the connectivity needs of the content, and not differentiate between content providers themselves. So differentiate between content based on the connectivity needs, but don't differentiate among content providers themselves. So this kind of like borders on what you were saying about per flow based pricing. So as long as they're allowed to do that, ISPs claim that in fact enhances the overall user experience by giving them the flexibility to provide the appropriate connectivity service for content that requires, let's say, high quality of service. Okay, so two key questions have to be answered for us to make inroads into this network neutrality debate. So, who is benefiting from content provider participation and to what extent, and whether the content provider themselves are being adversely affected through this content provider pricing. So, we'll look into both of these questions by modeling network neutrality related restriction as a ceiling on the maximum price that can be charged to the content provider. Okay. So Q bar will be the ceiling on the maximum price that can be charged to the content provider. So we'll do that analysis in terms of surplus. So surplus is the net economic benefit to an agent. So our approach is the following. So we will assume the ceiling of Q bar and then derive the equilibrium conditions under that assumption. At those equilibrium conditions, we will evaluate the surplus for each of the entities, the end user, content provider, ISP, and the total surplus, as a function of Q bar. And then we'll analyze what happens to the surplus as Q bar changes. Okay, so that's going to be the approach we're going to take. So, for example, in a competitive market, with Q bar being the restriction on content provider pricing, and as long as this Q bar is less than the equilibrium price without content provider price restriction, we can show that the end user's price is simply going to be the cost of capacity mu minus the content provider price restriction Q bar. And the end user surplus is simply the net utility. Okay, the utility minus the cost at that Q bar. So similarly, we can derive the surplus functions for the content provider, the ISP, and the total surplus. Okay, so I'm not going to go into the details of the behavior of the surplus as Q bar changes, but so our results indicate that in a competitive market, the end user and the total surplus increases with Q bar. Okay, so as the pricing for the content provider pricing is relaxed, the end user and the total surplus increases. Now, from the content provider's point of view, there is a loss of surplus due to the price paid to the ISP, but there is a gain in surplus because of the increased usage by end users who now face reduced cost in the market. Okay. So indeed, we actually show that the net benefit to the content provider could actually be a gain if the end user's price sensitivity is sufficiently high and the cost of capacity is high.
Price sensitivity or insensitivity?
The price sensitivity is sufficiently high. So what it means is that, yeah, the price sensitivity is exactly the same as the elasticity of demand. Yeah, I just use a different term here, I guess. So the idea here is that if the end user is highly price sensitive, which means that in the first place, the end user's price was so high that the demand was kept low, and because of the subsidy that they're getting due to content provider participation, the usage goes up so much that the content provider ends up with a net surplus gain. That's the underlying intuition. So then the content provider benefits from participation in the market. And if the capacity cost can be kept low, the price sensitivity or the elasticity of demand required for the content provider to make a net gain out of participation is actually small. So the content provider surplus actually peaks at a value smaller than the value of Q bar, which is smaller than the equilibrium price. That's apparent because overall in a competitive market, what's being maximized is the total surplus. So total surplus increases consistently with Q bar.
I have a question so in the previous thing, the surplus that the content user is ending up with, and you're also saying that the content provider also ends up with a surplus. This is all very dependent on the fact that you're assuming that the user is not paying anything for the content, right? Because if users were not going to the content provider because of the costs, the content provider could as well reduce the cost of the content such that more users could join in.
That's right.
And so isn't that like a very big assumption, like saying that Google is free is not really true, right? Because Google isn't free. Or for that matter, much of the free source software is not free because somebody is paying for it finally. And some kind of a customer is paying for it, right?
Google, so who pays for the Google?
Well, if I say Google is a service provider and not just a content provider, Google it provides advertising service, for example. It says, okay, you pay me money and I'll put your ad up.
That's right.
Right? So if Google has to end up charging those customers more, the number of those customers will reduce.
That's right.
And so a lot of the things that we get free today might not be free tomorrow, right?
That's right. So
somebody is paying for my free Gmail is what I'm saying, right?
Right. So I'm focused on the broadband connectivity part. So to do a complete analysis, you probably need to include the content provider, the content provider, and then analyze the effect of, okay, if the content provider has an alternate source of revenue, what happens to that market? So you're extending the market by like further out there. So you're right.
So that
ultimately you probably need to take all of those things into account to get a complete picture. But yeah, you probably have to start off from somewhere simpler.
Yeah, that's fine.
And and so the set of end users that I'm thinking about here is a much larger set compared to the Google advertisers. That's a much smaller segment, right? So whether they are being adversely affected because Google now has to pay for the price here, it's not clear to me because Google's cost might have gone up, but the overall revenue potential has actually increased here. That's what the result shows.
Yeah, but my only question was that maybe the increase in revenue could have been gotten by other means too. But okay, in this case, because
That's
surplus
right,
free,
yeah.
you can't do anything more than what you're already doing.
That's right. Okay, so in the case of monopoly, the it's apparent that the ISP surplus increases with Q bar because ISP simply has much more flexibility in maximizing the net profit as Q bar is relaxed. The total surplus actually uh, maximizes at a threshold price QT. Okay. So, I mean, it's well known that monopoly surpluses, the total surplus in a monopoly is actually smaller compared to the total surplus in a competitive market. And any kind of pricing restriction can actually only improve it's possible to improve the total surplus through some pricing restriction. So, indeed, we show that there is a price point at which the total surplus is
So why
maximized.
isn't the ISP extracting the surpluses on both sides in the operating price?
So the ISP indeed extracts the surplus to the extent it's possible. With content provider pricing restriction, that has been prevented. So your question is like, why is they?
So if the let's see if I understand that. So if you let the price restriction go to infinity, is that when the ISP surplus flattens out?
Yeah.
He's getting all the surplus at that point.
That's right. The ISP is getting all
Right,
this.
so then it's-
Well, okay. I should not say the ISP. So the ISP can do the best with this kind of pricing mechanism. So there's still some surplus retained by the end user and the content provider, but that's like very minimal surplus. So the ISP has extracted a lot more.
So why is there any?
So okay, so with a usage price like the one that we assumed here, ISPs cannot extract all the prices because
Yeah, but why can't they have? Okay.
under the
It's fine. So
user
you're
has
saying
a
if they have a
utility that's
usage price and a fixed price that they can
Exactly.
they can gouge you for less.
they can use the fixed price to like take out
Yeah.
anything that's okay, so it turns out that surprisingly the end user surplus is also maximized at this threshold price. And we derived the threshold price in our work. I haven't gotten into the details of this thing. The threshold price can in fact be shown to be less than the equilibrium price. So this threshold price can be looked upon as a possible price restriction if we were to introduce this into this market, into a monopoly ISP market. And both the end user surplus as well as the total surplus is maximized at this threshold price. Okay. The content provider, even in the case of monopoly, actually can enjoy a net gain in the overall surplus if the same set of conditions hold. The condition that the end user's price sensitivity is sufficiently high and the cost of provisioning capacity is kept sufficiently low. And we can show that the content provider surplus actually peaks at a value of Q bar which is different from the threshold price QT. In fact, it's a little less than the threshold price QT. Okay. So we don't have any direct quantitative comparison of quantitative results on the comparison between ISP monopoly and competition. We can derive it for like specific utility functions and cost functions. So here's a table that shows the numbers for one particular case. So some specific assumptions on the utility function and the capacity costs. So it's apparent that so the table essentially plots the content provider price restriction on the left hand side and the resulting end user price, the content provider price, and the data rate. In the case of a competitive market, the data rate consistently goes up with content provider price restriction being relaxed. Whereas in a monopoly market, the data rate actually grows much slowly compared to the competitive market case. And in fact, if you notice, the data rate actually starts dropping when the content provider actually comes into the picture. So the monopoly effects are actually much worse compared to any anything on the network neutrality side.
So what happens to your results if you have this flat price?
What's your question?
If you just had flat price, I mean, you're sort of having like a
Usage
usage
price.
Pricing
Yeah.
for each user.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think the results will change qualitatively. I haven't analyzed. So we're in the process of looking at like the interplay between flat pricing and usage pricing and see like what the net effects are. The sense I get is that flat prices. I think the commonly held notion is that like flat pricing is actually better for the user, but that's not necessarily true if the ISP is actually a monopoly. The flat pricing, in fact, is the component that allows a monopoly to extract any remaining surplus out of the market.
But only for the last marginal user.
Again, if you have to insist that the flat
And you
price
still
has to
have
be
your
same for
elasticity of demand, right? I mean, that's the sort of
If the users are all the same, right? That's
yeah. So you can't
the
do that.
combination allows you to extract the last of the surplus.
Yeah.
And if they're different, you extract it from somebody
Sure.
who's the sort of the marginal user.
That's right. Yeah, but I think qualitatively
Yeah, but now here you have a content provider. So what do you do to them?
The problem is this problem is extremely big and very complicated because, like, you know, so if you go next week to join these thesis defense, you'll find out he's working on more or less the same problem, and the intersection of what you're doing with Joe is doing is essentially zero, even though on some big picture version, you'll say all everything the same thing.
I see. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think this is probably like I don't think there's been much work in this space, and it's probably time for us to like look at some of these aspects. But it is a pretty complicated picture eventually, and it's good to start off with some modeling effort in the space. But ultimately, what model will give us the maximum set of answers is yet to be determined.
In this case, the ISP has extracted all the surplus from the content providers.
No. Even in the ISP monopoly case, it extracted a lot more surplus, but it couldn't extract all of it because of what Roy was pointing to, which is unless you have a flat component, the usage component can extract only the marginal utility from the user. But the utility that the user had for all the remaining usage, that there is something that's left back with the user. Okay, so that actually essentially concludes the talk. So our work essentially extended the price-based rate allocation model, which is a well-known rate allocation model, to include content provider, which is the other side involved in this transaction. So we could show that internet connectivity can actually benefit from content provider participation, but the benefits are actually limited if the ISP is a monopoly. In particular, the content provider can actually benefit from participation in rate allocation through pricing if the cost of connectivity is low and the end user has a high price sensitivity. Any regulatory attention, I guess, is warranted more towards increasing ISP competition and decreasing the cost of capacity rather than any network neutrality related restriction. That's a conclusion.
I have a couple of questions. First, from a practical standpoint, how does price differentiation depend upon the ability of the ISP to inspect what traffic is going along the lines? If I just encrypt all the traffic,
Yeah.
then is it possible to completely bypass any neutrality?
Actually, I have like one slide on this thing. Maybe we can just talk about that thing. So, that's a good question. So from ISP's point of view, what they would want to offer, or what can probably like be allowed by regulators, is pricing on a service basis, in the sense that if you can offer a certain connectivity service, irrespective of who the content provider who's demanding that service is, and offer the same price to all of these content providers, then the content providers can choose that service depending upon their content. So you could offer an enhanced low latency service for voice packets, in which case any content provider with voice packet can choose to use that service. So differentiation based on content is okay, but differentiation based on content provider is probably not acceptable.
So that assumes that you can inspect the content, or you have an explicit agreement with the content provider to declare what you're.
Okay, so that's partly what this particular slide is talking about. I mean, if you insist on, so that's where the pricing aspect comes into the picture. Okay, if you insist on, let's say, uniform pricing with traffic differentiation, so you're going to charge the same price, but you're going to provide different network services depending upon the content's need. And the question again is like, who's going to determine what kind of content it is? Is the ISP going to like peek into the packet and determine what content it is? Or is the content provider going to mark it? Content provider will mark everything as voice if there's no price differentiation. So that might not be acceptable. But again, at the same time, ISPs having the ISPs doing that determination of which packet is what content might not also be acceptable.
Right.
So pricing comes out naturally as a choice in that case. So as long as you can price your service differently and let the market choose which kind of service you want, which kind of connectivity service you want, that's probably workable more.
So is there a real example of this two-sided market? I mean, besides, I think the Kindle thing he talked about
I know one.
sort of had like an implicit, yeah.
Yeah, grocery store. Grocery store, if you go to the cereal aisle, they charge the cereal companies aisle space to put their products in. Right? And they also charge you for essentially they charge also the users a fee, the shoppers a fee for their the ability to go to the store and pick things up. They're extracting surplus from both sides.
So I didn't know the chart and stuff.
Yeah, like grocery stores, many of it's like the aisles are like little condominium slots. Like they're leased by, General Mills leases this section and
Oh, that makes sense.
Post leases some other section.
I have another question.
Some sections are sort of more desirable.
No, you had
Yeah.
mentioned at some point that if, like in a general market, users can trade among themselves and affect the price.
Right.
But in broadband connectivity thing, we cannot. Now, let's assume that users have some sort of peer-to-peer network.
It's not easy, yeah, that's right.
Then that
It's
will
not-
affect. Okay.
It's not like it's not impossible.
Sure.
You can always buy a broadband connection and then
So you're like talking something like a Craigslist kind of thing where you can just go to a content provider and just.
No, you can share suppose there's price differentiation based on flows, and he's getting a different price, I'm getting a different price, because we don't have any way to talk to each other through a data pipe. But now if I have a peer-to-peer network that's transparent to the core network, then that affects the price.
yeah, so it's not impossible. Yeah.
So, I can't remember, do you remember the details of this price of simplicity?
Yeah.
So
So
what's it got to do with that?
so it's related in the sense that
I can't remember, it's, what's his name, Srikanth, Srinivas.
Srinivas.
Right, so he even came and talked about this, I can't remember now what it was.
Okay, so
So what's it got to do with that?
actually I'm kind of looking into some of those aspects. So as I said, so networks now can start defining certain services, okay, that they can offer to the end users as well as content providers, as opposed to having a best effort approach towards serving user packets and then pricing everything equally. They can actually have tiered services where they say that I'm going to treat this packet differently in some way, and how differently is something that needs to be determined. So one simple such service model is what's called as this metro pricing model. The idea here is that you just announce you divide your capacity logically into, let's say, n different pipes. And for each of those pipes, you announce a price. Simply because you announce a higher price to part of the capacity, the congestion there will be less. Less number of users will come into the picture. So the price of simplicity is looking into analyzing that kind of a service model. But that may not be the only kind of service model, and that's actually a very simplistic way to offer services, where you essentially minimize congestion, but you offer like no priority to any packets or anything like that. But you can take it like a few steps beyond and say like, what if I offer explicit priority to packets? What if so the priority could be a relative priority or it could be like a strict priority. So you can analyze all of these models from a pricing point of view and say like, what should be the prices charged by the ISP to provide these kind of services.
Yeah, but wasn't the punchline in that paper, sort of that doing this simple thing was sort of you're not losing much or
You're not gaining much really. Yeah, that's what it.
So that's what I thought. I thought that was really the punchline. Right?
Yeah, but then I mean you're assuming a certain very specific kind of service model, right? So it's not clear whether if you depending upon the user's utilities for certain kind of data rates, it might be that some service model where there's a strict priority to some users might actually end up getting the ISP a better revenue stream. So it's possible to look at those things. I haven't completely investigated some of these things. But again, I mean, if you remain in the data rate part, it's again harder to justify some of these things because many of the quality of service requirements are like more in terms of delay and those kind of other parameters rather than just the data rate part.
So shouldn't these models be biased towards like more reducing end user price, like cost, I mean the payment by end users than the content providers paying less?
So that was definitely part of the talk, right? We talked about end user surplus.
Yeah, but the thing is like, shouldn't you put some weights? It should be a weighted kind of optimization than to. You didn't show
There's no
the
God who says, oh, we should give
Yeah,
the
so-
end user
so-
this way and the
So if you're an ISP, why do you care about? You're caring about your own surplus, and if you're a content provider, you care about your own surplus. And if
You
you're
can
an
argue
end
with
user,
the
you care about-
regulator if they are interested to care more about the end user surplus.
Yeah.
But typically that's not the case. They in fact would look more at the total surplus. Because you could be owning the shares in the content provider market or the ISP market, right? If you're paying high for your broadband connection, you could be getting a high dividend from your Verizon shares. So they look at the total surplus as what they need to focus on. But yeah, I
Who
mean,
is the they?
regulators.
Baby
Right, we have any other questions?